Whew. It's cold. It's a cold night. It's supposed to be spring, but it's still really cold. It's not warming up as much as it usually does. Yeah, it might even be... I don't think it's below freezing, but it's pretty damn close to freezing. Anyway. I was up late, and I couldn't sleep, so I decided to go out for a walk. And actually, I was listening to an Inmendham video, because that's one of my guilty pleasures. That's one of my little vices. I do actually enjoy Inmendham videos, but also I have listened to so many of them, and Inmendham goes over and over the same subjects, or the same subject, really. So you don't have to listen to what he says, really. You kind of know what he's saying. I just find it kind of good background noise. Kind of helps put me to sleep. But I have listened to what he has said, and I certainly have taken his perspective seriously, and I find it to be an interesting perspective, because in a way it's the opposite of mine, where it's diametrically opposed on certain axes, but on the other hand, we are in agreement on certain things. In particular, we are in pretty close agreement about biological realism, and I would say, well, again, fairly close agreement on psychological realism, or at least, let me put it this way. We have similar views on biology and psychology, although I'd say my psychology is better. My psychological views are better. Well, my biological views are better too, but I mean, there's not, other than the kind of silly notion Inmendham has that we didn't evolve to eat meat, he doesn't get very much wrong about biology. And I think he gets a few things wrong about psychology, but he has a much better understanding of human nature than, the typical leftist, or most people, He has certainly thought about those things quite a bit. And I respect that. That's impressive. Someone who actually thinks about the world, who doesn't just kind of take whatever he's given at face value and sort of rush off and just do stuff like most people. He questioned a lot of things and rejected a lot of things, but he retained some things that I rejected at an early age. In particular, altruism, or more generally, morality, and hedonism. Although I know Inmendham doesn't like the word hedonism as a description of his value system, but it is an accurate term because it just means that he situates value in the subjective experiences of pain and pleasure. For Inmendham, those are the things that matter. It's the feelings of pain and pleasure that sentient beings experience that are the ultimate source of all value. Nothing else matters. It's just what you feel. And when I was very young, I rejected hedonism. I rejected altruism, or again, morality, more generally, and I rejected hedonism. And I rejected those things because of biological and psychological theorizing, and also because of philosophical skepticism and philosophical inquiry. I saw that those were assumptions. They were not necessary assumptions. I could exist without them. I would not disappear in a puff of smoke if I didn't believe in them. And so I decided not to believe in them. Because, I also saw that they had some implications that didn't make a lot of sense. And they conflicted with my understanding of life, I guess. Life is selfish, so life is not altruistic. Life is hedonistic, or at least sentient life is hedonistic. But that doesn't mean that the pursuit of pleasure is a rational goal. And I decided it wasn't, because, or the avoidance of pain. Either of those things was a rational goal. So I rejected hedonism, partly on the grounds that it was an assumption, an unjustified assumption, and partly on the grounds that, based on my psychological theorizing and my philosophical analysis, I came to believe that there was no winning at that game. Not just no winning, but no way to get it ahead at all. That it was intrinsically zero-sum. And I guess also that it's not the point of action. It's the motivator of action. Right? Desire is there to drive us. But it's not the destination. It's the motivator. It's the thing that pushes us to do one thing versus another. We don't act... in a sense we act to avoid pain and get pleasure, but in another sense we don't. In another sense we act to reproduce. And those feelings and that mechanism of desire is just a driving force. It's like a steering wheel plus propulsion in a sense. It drives the brain forward, and it also defines forward and backward. So it defines where we're supposed to go, and it pushes us in that direction. But it's an internal mechanism. And we are beings that live in an external reality, and we move around in it. And our raison d'etre is to act into that external reality, to reproduce. Okay, now I don't want to go through my whole worldview in this. I really want to talk about Efilism. I will eventually reveal my worldview in its entirety. But I don't want to do it all in one midnight walk. So I'll stick to Efilism, which is what I wanted to talk about. And I'm going to talk about Efilism as Inmendham presents it. I haven't read the professional philosophers who write on that topic. I guess, what is it, Chioran? Or I don't know how to pronounce it. That guy, and Benatar, I guess. So I don't know what those guys have to say, but I'm pretty familiar with Inmendham, so I'll use him as the proponent, or the antagonist in the discussion, I guess. He certainly is very antagonistic in his style, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just pointing it out. Yeah, I'll present Efilism from what I think his perspective is, but I think it's probably the same for most Efilists. Efilism is a rejection of life, right? It's a rejection of life. It's a moral rejection of life. Oh, here's a little deer. I always see them here. Ah, hello there. Yeah, this neighborhood is full of deer, and they're totally unafraid of people. This one's just standing here about 10 feet away from me. Anyway, I'll see more as I go along, I'm sure. Alright, yeah, so Efilism is a rejection of life. And it is both a moral rejection, in the sense that it views life as morally bad, or morally repugnant, or something like that. And it also is a rejection of life as having negative value for the liver. Not for the liver as your organ, but for the being, the sentient being that lives. The life is a curse, not a blessing. Okay. And this rejection is based on biological realism, combined with a value system that has hedonism as the primary or sole non-moral value and the base value, right? Because you can't have moral values until you have non-moral values. There has to be something that is good for the individual before there can be any moral goods or bads, Like before, because like most morality is about not harming others. Well, there has to be some notion of harm that exists first, right? So, this philosophical rejection of life arises within a value system that is hedonistic and altruistic, that has hedonism as its base value. Pain and pleasure are viewed as the ultimate sources of value, and the only sources of value, ultimately. And then there is a moral value, which could be defined as either altruism, or possibly in a more negative sense as do no harm. So it could be nice, like try to make others feel good, or it could just be don't make others feel bad. And these values are generally accepted by the culture of the modern West. They are what I would call humanist values. Humanism is a worldview that is, well, I wouldn't say it's entirely just based on those values alone, but those are the values of humanism, and those are the values of Efilism. So Efilism arises out of humanist values. And the difference between Efilism and humanism is that, well, I suppose there are two differences. Actually, I was going to just say one. One being biological realism, which is just understanding how life works and having a realistic view of human nature instead of an idealistic view. But the other one is, I guess, the moral in-group for Efilism is all sentient beings. All beings that can feel pain and pleasure are included in the moral in-group, and they're given equal weight, or at least their feelings are given equal weight. And this is also true of veganism, right? The vegan philosophy, if it's based on, concern for animal welfare and not just on health or something like that. Oh, there's another deer and it freaked me out. Wow, it's a big one. It's like right in front of me. Oh, there's two of them there. I didn't even see the other one. Walked right by it. Yeah, they're so quiet. You can't see them, and then suddenly they're there. Anyway, where was I? Okay, so, I was talking about veganism. Veganism that's based on a concern for animal welfare is kind of in between humanism and Efilism. Now, the humanist and the vegan deny I suppose you could say, the horrors of life. The horrible reality of life. That life is a struggle. It's a zero-sum game. Or as I say usually, it's a zero-sum game at the margins. Meaning that once the ecosystem is filled up, you can't add new players without displacing other players. Right? There's a finite flow of energy through any ecosystem. And life has a tendency to use it up, kind of utilize it to the maximum capacity for driving life processes, and life reproduces to excess, as living beings are driven to reproduce, and so life is a struggle. It's a bloody mess, right? It's creatures fighting and killing and eating each other, or even if they're not eating each other, they're fighting. People don't see this violence when they look at nature, partly because they have romanticized it away. Or they don't see it because they see nature in terms of its human uses and not for what it is. So you might look at a peaceful forest, the trees waving in the wind, blah, blah, blah. And it's beautiful. I love nature. But I can also look at that and see that those trees are engaged in a struggle to the death. They're fighting each other for the light and for the water and the soil nutrients, and so on and so forth. And they're shading out the little baby trees that are struggling to grow up from below. And meanwhile, they're getting chewed on by deer from down below, perhaps, or insects that bore into them. So it's a big fight, and we don't always see that. We only see the fights when they are kind of on the scale and of the form that we're used to as humans. We see a fight between two deer, let's say, like two males battling it out. We recognize that as a fight. Or if we see a coyote or a wolf chasing a deer, we recognize that as part of a life and death struggle. We don't see that as peaceful. But that's everywhere. That's in everything. That's in every little snail and barnacle and starfish, in every tree, every little bit of moss. Like everything, everywhere, is fighting. So, Efilists are realists about biology. And they see that biology is not altruistic. It is selfish. And it is violent. And it has more losers than winners. Because into this game are spawned many, many new players all the time. And most of them, well, they all end up dying, but most of them die young. Right? So when you look at life in that way, it does seem to be rather horrific. And it certainly doesn't satisfy altruistic, moral intuitions. It's quite the opposite. It's a vicious, selfish struggle. Now the other thing that they believe, that Efilists believe, is that there's a lot of suffering in this struggle for sentient beings because they have this motivation system, desire, that drives them to compete in this desperate struggle to exist and to reproduce. And that generates a lot of negative feelings. It generates a lot of pain. Now you might say, like I would say, that pain and pleasure balance out, so it's irrelevant. I think they don't. I'm pretty sure Efilists don't think that's the case. They, I think, view life as having more pain than pleasure on average. But I'm not sure they would always make that argument. I think sometimes they will just say that it's not worth the risk. Your life might be good or it might be bad. Maybe you would get more pleasure. Maybe you would get more pain. But there's this huge downside risk. And you don't need to live. Right? Like before you exist, your absence isn't some great tragedy. Right? The absence of all the living beings that could have existed but didn't is not a great tragedy. So there's like no harm in not creating another living being in their view. But there could be great harm in generating a new sentient being who then has to go out into life, compete in this struggle, eventually die, and along the way suffer, and suffer horrendously. Right? So that is their view. And it is certainly more realistic than the kind of romanticized view of life that we are fed in pretty much all of the entertainment / propaganda that we consume. You know, the shit that we're fed by these companies to amuse us or whatever. You know, like, let's say, the show Friends, you know. Like, I don't know, like even nature shows that show a certain amount of the brutality of life often have this kind of happy music playing, and they have a little moral at the end, like, it's all part of the balance of nature. When something gets eaten by something else, you know, but anyway. There's a lot of romanticization of nature, let alone human nature. There's a huge amount of romanticization of human nature. So anyway, that's Efilism in a nutshell. Life sucks because there's more pain than pleasure, or at least there's this huge potential for harm. There's nothing that it solves. Therefore, the imposition of life, or the creation of life, imposition is a loaded term, right? They use some of these loaded terms, you know, kind of rhetorical tricks. At least Inmendham does, you know, kind of using terms like imposing life as if there was someone already there for it to be imposed on. You know, like a baby has life imposed on it. That's not really true. A baby is just created. But it is true that once you create a baby, now you have created a living being that can suffer and that will eventually die. Right? So in a way, having a child is the same as being a murderer in a strange way, because you have guaranteed now that somebody will die, right? You have committed an act that guarantees that someone is going to die, and you have done this either out of gross negligence or out of your own conscious choice. So there is an argument to be made that having a child is murder. I say that half as a joke and half seriously because, I've thought about this before. It didn't just occur to me. It's true that if murder is to, willfully cause someone to die, well, then birth is murder, right? Anyway, so the Efilist position is life is harmful, or has a great potential for harm. I think they're a little bit conflicted on whether life could have positive value or not. Their psychological theories don't seem to be as clear as mine. Mine gives a very clear answer, that there's no net pain or pleasure in life. Their views don't. But setting that aside, it's a pretty logical conclusion from those premises, from those value premises, combined with biological realism. Life is certainly violent and selfish. And so you could argue that life is harmful to the sentient organism that has to live it, and also that, in a sense, life is evil. Life is morally bad, or at least, if nature were a conscious agent, then it would be morally bad. Alright. So I think that covers Efilism. And the way that Efilism differs from veganism and humanism is that veganism focuses on human-caused harm to animals. And so veganism is not really biologically realistic, because I think vegans sort of assume that if it happens in nature, it's okay. Nature is good. When animals suffer and die in nature, that's okay, that's just part of nature, that's just how it works, that's the way things ought to be. There's a kind of naturalistic fallacy going on there, that nature is good, but when we do it to animals, we're doing something bad. So it's either that farm animals have really bad lives because they're in cages or whatever, or it's that it's not morally acceptable for us to make animals suffer, or I don't know, I guess to bring them into existence, right? Because farming is bringing animals into existence. But when nature does it, that's fine. So that's a kind of contradictory stance, or a rather strange stance based on a naturalistic fallacy, I guess, or a naturalistic assumption that nature is good, but humans were bad. We're mucking around with stuff. Right? Okay. So I would say vegans have kind of idealism about nature and about human nature. And so do humanists. The only difference is there that humanists have even more inflated egos about humanity, like humans are so special and wonderful, and, they're concerned with humans, not with animals. They draw the circle of moral concern so that it includes humans, and maybe there's a little bit of room for some animals, or maybe we can care about animals a little bit, care about nature a bit. But they really focus on humans. They put humans on a pedestal. So that's Efilism and its relation to humanism and veganism and its value basis. Now, why did I want to talk about it? Well, someone said to me the other day, or someone asked me, because I had introduced him to Inmendham. He had never seen Inmendham's videos before, but he has somewhat similar views on life. And so I pointed him to some Inmendham videos. And I told him I had watched a lot of Inmendham's videos, and I, had been following him now for, 5 years, I guess. And he asked why I follow Inmendham and watch his videos, since my views are almost the exact opposite. You could say I'm a lifist. I reject altruism, and I reject hedonism, and I embrace life and reproduction. And he thought it was a little bit weird that I like Inmendham videos, and I said, well, it's an interesting position, right? The position that's diametrically opposed to your own is, of course, one of the most interesting. Listening to people who you agree with all the time isn't very interesting. But listening to people that you disagree with in a certain well-defined way is kind of interesting. And it doesn't bother me. It's not like it bothers me that Inmendham has his views. And we agree on biological realism. So, in a sense, at least on some things, we're closer together than... I'm closer to Inmendham than I am to a humanist. Because a humanist has Inmendham's value assumptions. But a humanist is also basically a biological idealist. Or fantasizer, as Inmendham would say, a deluded retard, something like that. Someone who's never really thought about it, or just assumes that life is wonderful and nature is, big party or something. Alright, well, I'm going to end it there because I'm getting tired. It's pretty late. As always, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you guys later.